The best Duke basketball players don't run away from challenges, and that's what we're seeing right now from Caleb Foster. What a warrior, and super excited for what this guy is going to do in his junior year for Duke.
You are Locked On Blue Devils, your daily podcast on the Duke Blue Devils. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everybody. Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Blue Devils podcast. My name is JJ Jackson. It's so great to have you here with us today on Wednesday, May 28th, 2025. Locked On Blue Devils is your one-stop shop where we discuss everything going on inside the life of Duke athletics. We talk Duke basketball nearly every single day of the year, and that's going to be the case once again here today as we continue our 2024-2025 player review series. I want to talk about the sophomore season that Caleb Foster had. Man, a lot of ups, a lot of downs, but he continued to grind it out. And the best news as we look at his next steps, he's not running away from the challenge. He's going to be back for his junior season for the Blue Devils. Who better to have this conversation with than one of my good friends, Raul Clement from the Devil's Den podcast. Excited to chat with him on the show here today. If you have not done so already, please be sure to follow and subscribe to Locked On Blue Devils for free, wherever it is that you get your podcast. Leave us a 5-star rating and written review. Also, you can watch our show each and every day on YouTube. Go ahead and like this video, share it with your friends, continue to grow our channel here by subscribing. And a special shout out to all of our everydayers out there who make us a part of your routine each and every day. All of this is not possible without you guys. So thank you so much for that as we get closer and closer to 4,000 subscribers on YouTube. Can't wait to celebrate that milestone with you guys. All right, we're on X at LO_Blue Devils. We're also on Instagram and TikTok to see exclusive content over there. But as mentioned, today we got to talk about the man of the hour, Caleb Foster, in the season that he had for the Blue Devils this past year. And who better to join me for that conversation than the aforementioned Raul Clement, who's here with me now. How are you, my friend? Good to see you once again.
Yeah, man, I'm great. Just excited to talk basketball, during the kind of doldrums of the summer here.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you have the doldrums of the summer, what you like to do is kind of reflect back on the year that just was. A Duke basketball team that wins the ACC regular season. They win the tournament, and then they go on to the NCAA tournament and make that crazy run all the way to the Final Four. So let's break it down player by player as we've been doing over the last few weeks. And today, really want to focus in on what we saw out of Caleb Foster, the sophomore this past season for the Blue Devils. As we take a look at the year that he had, we'll get to some numbers and that sort of thing in just a moment. Take me back a year ago, Raul. Like, what is your thought? What are your expectations for Foster going into last season?
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. I was extremely high on him going into his sophomore season. It's like I thought he had a pretty good freshman season overall. He shot the ball well. I thought he played his role well. When Tyrese Proctor was out for a little bit, he kind of became the primary point guard. And I thought he handled himself adequately. And I just, like his skill set. And I thought he could kind of take that into the season. When you were looking at Duke's roster, there wasn't really anybody who projected to be great at getting to the rim. And I was hoping that Caleb Foster would be able to be that. And through kind of one circumstance or another, he turned out not to be the best fit in the starting lineup. And Sion James just frankly outplayed him. And then things kind of tailed off from there where it seemed like he lost a little bit of confidence. And the coaching staff maybe lost some confidence in him. But it's really cool to have seen him work through all of that. And I think at the end of the season, you got a tease of what is to come.
Yeah, the end of the year was awesome. I'll get to that in just a moment here. Looking at back to a season ago and kind of putting expectations out there, his freshman year, he plays 27 of the 36 games for the Blue Devils, missing the final 9 games of the season with the injury that held him out of Duke's run all the way to the Elite Eight in the postseason there. Going into the preseason, fall 2024, the basketball world out there, Raul, names Caleb Foster to the Jerry West Shooting Guard of the Year top 20 preseason watch list. I mean, that is the level. It wasn't just a Duke thing, right? Yep. I mean, nationally, a lot of people are excited about what this guy was going to do going into his sophomore season. I had completely forgotten that he was given that much kind of national hype going into the year.
Well, he's a highly ranked recruit coming out of high school. He's going into his sophomore year, which at Duke, frankly, these days is kind of a rarity.
Yeah.
So, of course, the expectations are going to go through the roof, and especially on a frankly loaded team like we had.
Yeah, alongside the star freshmen that were coming in, and then some of the guys
Yep.
returning with Foster. I guess the only guy in that situation would be Proctor, but his
Mhm.
backcourt mate, and excited to see what he's going to be able to do. So it's a year for Caleb Foster that we talked about, had very many highs, had very many lows, and we kind of look at what he was able to do for the Blue Devils. As those watching us on YouTube are able to see us put his numbers up on the screen here. 4.9 points per game, 1.7 rebounds, 1.4 assists. Very measly numbers for Mr. Foster, who played just 14 minutes a game on the season. And I thought it was noteworthy that 13 games this season, he played 10 or fewer minutes. And to compare it for people in terms of the run that he had out there, he plays 14 minutes this past year. As a freshman, Caleb Foster was averaging 25 minutes a game for Duke.
Well, I think part of that was his struggles, but part of that was just a function of the roster.
Right.
So the year before, the guard depth just wasn't nearly as good. And then this last season, you've got Khan, who's, he's playing on the wing, but he's essentially a guard. You've got Sion, you've got Tyrese, just, a lot of perimeter talent. And he just kind of got shut out of that.
Yeah, and then you're going back and forth between him and Evans, right? As to
Yep,
who's going
exactly.
to be that other guy coming off, and with Evans shooting it as well as he did from the outside, certainly was telling. What numbers stand out to you for Caleb Foster? Is there anyone in particular when you look at this year that he just had?
I mean, for me, I think it's just the overall lack of minutes. You really expected him to be more in the 20-minute range. And even towards the end of the season, when he started playing a little bit better, the minutes were still pretty limited. So, and then I think the other thing is just like the number of shot attempts he would take while he was out there in those minutes. When you compare him to somebody like Evans, who was just an absolute gunner, right? Like,
Yeah,
Evans probably, I don't have it in front of me, but I would not be shocked if he took twice the volume of shots per minute. And so I was always just kind of watching Foster, wanting him to be just a little bit more aggressive. And he's never been the most assertive player, even as a freshman. So I think that's something he's got to work on this next year. And it's easier said than done, right? Because if you're thinking too hard about it, then you can lose confidence and it's kind of hard to get it back. But I thought he showed some signs that maybe he can progress to being a more assertive player. Like it's kind of like, the player that you see over the off season and these highlights and these practice scrimmages and stuff, and I even have had firsthand reports from guys like John Watson of being at practice and saying, oh, he's the guy who can get to the rim and he's
yeah,
really assertive and he puts a lot of downhill pressure. And then for whatever reason, when the game rolls around, he just seems afraid of making a mistake.
that's not what you see. Sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's certainly something to continue to monitor for Caleb Foster as we go into his junior season. There were a couple of really good standout games, like we're talking about for Foster this past season that he had for the Blue Devils, and excited to see kind of how he can build off of those towards the back half of the stretch going into a junior season. His numbers, again, 43% shooting from the floor, 34% from three, 68.8% from the free throw line for Caleb Foster, something that you definitely want to see improve moving forward. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those standout games that he had this past season and how he factors in to Duke's rotation and roster going into the next season after we take our first break. Locked On Blue Devils here today, brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live with player props, performance trends, same-game parlays, and so much more. Fans have had more ways than ever before to play smart and win big. Looking at all the action tonight, Game 5 of the Western Conference Finals, the Oklahoma City Thunder back at home, favored by 8.5 points on FanDuel. The over-under for Game 5 set at 220.5. I think that's a really enticing game to get in on the action for. $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. New to FanDuel, once again, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA and Locked On Blue Devils. Okay, forward we go on the program. JJ Jackson alongside my pal Raul Clement from the Devil's Den podcast, talking about the sophomore season for Caleb Foster. Looking at his best games, memorable moments. What do you think of when you think about the year that he just had?
I don't know that it was, a big game scoring wise, but I thought the second North Carolina game is when he started to really get his confidence back. And he came in, he just played really well.
I
He had a
loved
great
that game.
drive to the
Yeah.
rim. He had some really nice passes. He just looked confident and assertive. He played great defense in that game. So that would have been the one, at Carolina that I'm referring to.
His long tip out that he had on the
Yeah,
defensive
yeah.
end of the diving all out effort. When that happened, that was kind of like, okay, this is
Yeah.
because it's worth noting he played in 38 of 39 games this season. The only game he did not play was the final home game of the season, the game that was immediately before this Carolina game. And so how are you going to respond? You didn't play the last game. Now we're calling on you to come into the action. And he was just ready to go, man, and make those plays.
Yeah, you have to wonder if that was a motivational tactic by Shire or what was going on there. At the time, it was pretty confusing to me. It's like, okay, yes, his minutes had been reduced to like 7 to 10 minutes a game, but for him just not to play at all on, senior night at
Yeah.
home was just pretty surprising. And I thought he was just going to be out of the rotation from then on. And I thought it's, signified that he was done. He was transferring,
Yeah.
right? And then he kind of just turns it around from there on.
Yeah, because so many times throughout the year, it's like, yep, he's going to transfer. And then maybe a couple of days later, you feel maybe there's a chance he comes. No, he's going to transfer. No, he's going to transfer. And ultimately, he doesn't. Kudos to him for how well he played. I thought he rebounded really aggressively in the Alabama game and even in the Houston game. I thought that he had some big sparks for the Blue Devils. A season high 13 points for Foster versus Wofford. How about 12 points versus Illinois and Madison Square Garden, going 2 of 2 from three-point range? That was one, Raul, where Duke had the game decided early on, and Caleb Foster came in and was like, well, it's time for me to get mine, and was super efficient and aggressive. I love seeing it.
Yeah, he seemed to play better, at least early on in the year when there was less pressure on him.
Sure.
So, he'd come in the last 10 minutes of a blowout and he just, get his shots up and, score 10 points in 4 minutes or something. But I just think, that again comes back to his confidence.
Scoring figures to share for Foster. He had 8 games where he scored 10-plus points this past season. He also had 8 games with 10-plus as a freshman. He had a career-high 18 points as a freshman versus Michigan State, so just a season high of 13. This year, 7 games with 2 or more three-point makes on the season. And then sharing the basketball, he had a season high 4 assists 3 different times, a career high 7 assists as a freshman, kind of sharing the basketball, given at the point that he came into those basketball games. Oftentimes we didn't really see him set up for those assist numbers. People, because people hear, wait, his career high was 7 as a freshman and he only had 4 in his best game as a sophomore.
Well, a lot of that was a product of the minutes, but also I think he was often playing with bench players late in the game, and those guys just aren't as good at making shots, right? So he was the offense essentially when he was in for those minutes. I did think that he, towards that stretch I keep referring to at the end of the year, I thought his passing got better, and I really liked the decision making in those last 8 or 9 games or so. I thought he was getting in the lane and kicking it out to shooters and just generally making the right play, which, I think was something that was an obstacle for him earlier in the year and was one of the reasons he didn't play as much. Last year's team was so good at moving the ball, and he was a little bit of a ball stopper, and it just didn't quite fit the style of the other players. But I thought he kind of seemed to learn towards the end of the year, okay, this is the way I need to play. So I'm just hoping he can kind of take that forward, because I see next year's team as being, John Shire's sort of approach to offense is just kind of everybody eats, you share the ball, you make the right play, you kick out for open threes, that kind of thing.
Dude, here you are steering the conversation exactly where I wanted to go, because I wanted to go towards next season and kind of how things project for Caleb Foster making the decision to come back for his junior year. You have to figure many conversations were had between him and Coach Shire. Coach Shire's even spoke about this. But as they set up a junior year, you look at the roster kind of around him, it's easy to figure Caleb Foster is going to be asked to do a good bit for this Duke team next season.
Yeah, like I kind of mentioned earlier, the guard depth was a real strength last year, and I don't think it's going to be on the same level this next season. For me,
Sure.
next year's team is built around the front court. So I think there's a clear role and need for a guy like Caleb Foster. It's like, Caden Boozer might be really good, but he's
Yeah.
only a freshman, and it's just there's a lot of question marks, right? Harris didn't play many minutes last year. So, Evans was a role player in a very specific role where he would just come in and just take 3-pointers. Can he expand his game? What position does he end up playing? Does he play more at the 3 or the 2? And so there's a clear need for a guy like Caleb Foster to emerge. And I think
Yeah.
he's really the X factor to next year's team's success.
Yeah, the question, how do you get SAR involved? What does
Oh yeah, for
Haminia's
sure.
effort and minutes look like? And then the bigs, to your point, like you talked about. But it does feel like it's a pretty big role for Caleb Foster. Before we go to our next break and kind of talking about Duke's Caleb Foster from Harrisburg, North Carolina, just the fact that he didn't transfer, in this day and age, and especially with Duke basketball, man, even before the transfer portal was as rampant as it is. You talked about it. We're a one and done factory in so many ways. You don't get to form these bonds with players as a fan so frequently. He did not run from the challenge. I think that's easy to root for this upcoming season, and I hope a lot of Duke basketball fans will join me in those efforts as well and wanting him just to have a massive, massive junior season.
Well, I've spoken to a lot of fans, and that's one of the things they miss about college basketball. Like if you grew up watching college basketball in the 90s or the 2000s, you got to see players develop over 4 years.
Yeah,
And those were the best stories, right? Especially guys who struggled and then really emerged as juniors and seniors. Like I think of a guy like Nolan Smith, for example, who he was just okay his first 2 years, but as a
yeah,
junior, he becomes a star, right? And it's like those are the players who end up being most special to me in my memory. So I'm hoping, Caleb can, make a similar style jump. Like maybe he doesn't jump up into that Nolan Smith 17 points per game range. That would be a huge jump. But even if he's like at, 11 points and 4 or 5 assists or something like that, that would just be huge for this team. And it would be really easy to root for, like you said. Like, to come back to last season, Tyrese Proctor was a guy that I just loved rooting for because
same.
of his story, right? And he just come through everything with John, and John had a special relationship with him. You could see that at the end of the Alabama game, the way
Yeah.
they just embraced multiple times.
It was awesome. I'm hoping that Caleb Foster can have that level of impact for Duke this next season. Certainly think he will. Excited to see all of that come together. All right, let's talk a little bit more about that roster specifically. And then today we actually have some schedule news from the ACC regarding Duke basketball going into the new year that we'll touch on when Locked On Blue Devils continues here in a moment. Thank you again for making Locked On Blue Devils your first listen and your first watch here today. For your second listen, make sure that you check out the Portal Show. Locked On's very own Brian Smith has the latest rumors, portal entries, and signings. Be the most informed fan on the rapid changes to the college football landscape. Find the Portal on YouTube or wherever it is that you listen to your podcasts. Also, be sure to check out Locked On College Basketball. Hosts Isaac Shade and Andy Patton do a remarkable job keeping you up to date on the sport that we all love. And it is Duke, of course. So they are featured quite frequently in conversations over on Locked On College Basketball. Make sure you go and check that show out. Okay, final segment here on today's episode of Locked On Blue Devils. My name is JJ Jackson. His name is Raul Clement from the Devil's Den podcast, talking about this Duke team going into the new season. Today is the deadline for players to determine whether or not they're going to come back to school or remain in the NBA draft. Cedric Coward was the last big piece we were waiting to hear from from Duke. And a couple of days ago, we learned that he is ultimately going to stay in the NBA draft and never play a game for the Duke Blue Devils. Leaving that note aside, as we pull up kind of an overview of scholarships, the roster so far for Duke, how do you feel about it going into the new year?
Yeah, man, I think that those last two additions are going to be huge for Duke, especially with, Coward deciding to stay in the draft. Duke really needed some depth at the kind of wing position. And Sarr is just a versatile player from the tape I've watched. He's big for a guard. So I can see him playing any position from 1 to 3. So that fills a real need for Duke. And then Wilkins, I think he's going to be more of a spot minutes player, but he's big enough where he could play the 4 pretty easily. Maybe he'll play a little bit of 3 too. He has some wing skills. So, it just kind of gives us a little bit of front court depth that, maybe, helps Duke out if there's an unexpected injury. Like Malik Brown
Yeah.
obviously had his share of injuries last year. So you got to be aware of stuff like that. So I really like the way the roster has turned out. Like, obviously you would have loved Coward for his talent level, or you would have maybe loved for Tyrese Proctor to stay for his senior season. But given the circumstances and what Shire had to work with, I think he did a remarkable job, like fleshing out this roster on the fly at the last minute.
Yeah, to see it laid out like this, and again, to make the last minute pivots that he has to do, it's kind of wild to think about what it was as soon as the Houston game ends, right?
Yep.
As soon as the season comes to a close, and you expect all the freshmen projected lottery picks to declare, but they got to do it, and then all of a sudden Shelton Henderson decommits, and then you pivot from that. Then you've got Cedric Coward, you pivot there, and just crazy work done by Jon Scheyer, and really fired up with the squad. I think Duke's going to make some noise going into the upcoming season for sure. With that being said, and with that in mind, we've now learned the ACC told us they were going to reduce the schedule from 20 games down to 18 league games. We knew that a week or two ago. Now today, we're hearing and we're seeing the reports of what the matchups look like. We knew that with the schedule model changing, some things would be different for the Blue Devils in terms of the number of games that they would play against certain opponents and that sort of thing. I'll kind of put the numbers up here on the screen for people. Again, 18 conference games per team, one primary partner that you'll play home and away every year, a secondary opponent that's determined annually that you also play home and away, and then 14 single opponents, meaning there is one school you will not play. Before we get to the specifics of the Duke schedule, what did you make of this change?
I was in favor of it, and it's simply because with the ACC having been down for the last few seasons, I wanted Duke to have the opportunity to be able to schedule a couple more non-conference games. And so dropping from 20 games, which frankly is a lot of conference games, right, to 18, just gives Shire a little more wiggle room there to schedule something. We saw last year he scheduled a game in February, and he's doing the same thing this year. But then just having 2 more slots to fill in the schedule, I think will really help Duke's resume heading into March.
Which is what it's all about, making sure you're positioned well for the resume that time of year. So with that being said, as expected, Duke finds out that, hey, your primary opponent is the North Carolina Tar Heels. You're going to be stuck with them annually twice. And that's, of course, what we wanted. Exactly. We wanted to make sure we held on to both games, one at Cameron each year, one at the Dean Smith Center there at the Dean Dome. So that'll continue. Duke's going to play Louisville twice, and then they will not play against Miami. No matchup with Jay Lucas for this upcoming season. How do you feel about all this news?
Well, my initial thoughts are that Duke got a pretty tough draw.
Mm-hmm.
Playing Louisville twice. When you look at the ACC, I'm expecting the top 3 teams to be in some order: Duke, Louisville, and possibly NC State, if I had to guess. I haven't looked at every roster in detail, but those are just the 3 that jump out to me.
Same.
I think Carolina will be a little bit down. I have no clue what to make of teams like Wake Forest and Clemson. Would need to do a little bit more research on that, but just playing, one of the top 3 teams twice, like in Louisville there, just inherently makes Duke's draw tough. And then you've got some tough road games as well at NC State, at Virginia Tech. Maybe they won't be that good, but that's always a place that's been tough for Duke to play. So um, Duke's going to have their work cut out for them, but hopefully that non-conference schedule will get them ready for it.
Yeah, and then, even further looking at the ACC schedule that's been announced with those home and away matchups, something like Stanford, Cal, SMU, they joined the league, and we're going to see Duke basketball go play at Stanford and at Cal. They've never done that before. So a couple of new venues to mark off for the Blue Devils, and they're going to be conference games.
Yeah, that should be really interesting.
Two road games against those ACC California schools.
Exactly. Yeah, because they didn't have either last year. So
right, both at
obviously
home.
Duke did play at SMU, but yeah, both the Cal and Stanford games were at home. And Stanford last year was a respectable team. And I think both those programs are kind of on the upswing with their new coaches. So it should be cool to play at these venues that, Duke has never played at before.
Yeah, emotional playing against Jalen Blakes with Stanford this past year. Now that his eligibility is done, don't have to have our heartstrings pulled at all in games like that. So that's exciting. Well, Raul, this has been awesome. Really enjoyed kind of breaking down Caleb Foster's season. Would love to hear from people down in the comments below how they felt about his year. Let us know what you think of the schedule and that sort of thing. You do great work with the Devil's Den podcast. Tell us a little bit about your show and how people can support you guys.
Yeah, so you can find episodes on any of your typical podcast streaming networks. And you can also find them at thedevilsden.com. We're associated with that recruiting website, The Devil's Den. So we try during the summer to maybe do like one episode a week. It's kind of down from the year where we're doing 2 or 3 a week. But we got some interesting stuff coming up. We're going to have some great guests on. I don't know if I can announce any of them yet, but you could look at last summer's lineup and maybe that'll give you some clues.
Yeah, stay tuned.
Just keep an eye out for that. Yeah.
That's awesome. All right, man. We'll do this again sometime soon, okay?
Yep.
All right. That's Raul Clement joining us here on today's episode of Locked On Blue Devils. Go support their work that they've got with the Devil's Den. Support us here at Locked On Blue Devils. Again, follow us on X at LO_Blue Devils. Also subscribe to our YouTube channel, please, as we continue to get closer towards 4,000 subscribers. More talk coming your way tomorrow. As always, go Duke. I'll talk to you tomorrow. My name is JJ Jackson. Thank you, and good day.